Well, I think it's a lot of things. It's all of his friends, his family, his associates, all of the people who contributed to him as a man before he became president, but then those people who surrounded him during the presidency itself.
Well, one of the things that we thought would be helpful in taking a remote character and making him more accessible as a human being would be to see him through the eyes of those people who worked most closely with him, as well as those who cared about him the most. And that includes his family and those people who were his personal secretaries, who stayed with him, in the case of Tobias Lear, virtually his entire adult life after the Revolution. Lear was there all the way through with a few gaps. Otherwise, we see through these people Washington acting as a human being, as a man who had problems with his temper, who cared deeply, did not always show it, but also a Washington who was more intellectually acute than often is portrayed.
And what about him would inspire such loyalty among his circle? From his youth, there were people who did generally circle him in a way. He was the kind of person who did inspire a great deal of loyalty, and was generally loyal to his friends too. Though, as we point out, there's some notable exceptions to that where Washington decided that maybe that certain people in his circle were not as valuable to him and the country as he had earlier thought. He didn't really expect them to not get along. They did not know each other very well at the beginning, and of course Jefferson was not even in the country at the beginning, so he came in kind of late. And so he did not anticipate that there would be this rivalry, and apparently they did not either. At first, for the first few months after Jefferson actually took his place, they did seemingly get along. It happens later, and it caught Washington by surprise, I think. And one of the things that we emphasize in the book is that Washington wanted harmony. And so as this rivalry became, and I think at first he didn't even realize that it was happening, but as it became apparent that it was happening, I think it greatly disturbed him, and that is one thing that he desperately wanted in his administration was harmony. And of course he wasn't going to have it.
Yeah, he was, as the revelations of this pretty intense dislike between Hamilton and Jefferson emerged, Washington was at last aware of it, but he did not necessarily want it to cause a rupture in his official family because of how it would appear. The stability of the government in terms of continuity in office, even if it did not exist, the appearance of harmony, he thought was quite important. As much so as if it didn't exist, even more so that it appeared that way. So when Jefferson tried to resign, Washington talked him out of it, even though it would have been certainly a more congenial atmosphere if Jefferson and Hamilton had not been so at daggers with each other.
Well, they'd known each other since the Revolution, and I think the fact that they were friends from the Revolution helped in that relationship. And as we point out initially, Washington did not know exactly what to do with Edmund Randolph as Attorney General because he had John Jay as the Chief Justice. And he saw him as being a perhaps more important advisor along those lines, whereas Randolph was more a personal legal advisor to the president. But gradually, as we do point out, that Jay saw himself and he saw the court as a separate branch of the government, which of course that's what it was intended to be, and so therefore it really wasn't appropriate for him to be an advisor to the president, because that did, in many ways, violate separation of powers.
And Jay as you know, Jay was asked, there was an inquiry about neutrality. And that was the first shock when they, to a man, he and the Associate Justice, they said, no, we're not offering an opinion, except under case circumstances. And there's good reason for that, because the court cannot deal in hypotheticals, inasmuch as what it does is it has a finality to it. It did not have the finality to it that it does now. This is the law of the land idea. It wasn't that much to it, but the court was established as a judicial body, and it was not to be used as a sounding board, a political sounding board. And that was made quite clear. Now, Washington really did have a great deal of affection for John Jay, because Jay had helped him during some really grim times during the Revolution. Jay was a careful, prudent patriot who was slow to come to the idea of independence, but once there, was completely committed to the idea. And his work on behalf of the Continental Army during the darkest days of 1777, 78, permanently endeared him to Washington, as it did Gouverneur Morris the same way.
I think he would have been a lot more important if he had been in the country. But since he spent the entire presidency abroad, that they could not consult on a regular basis. They did exchange a good many letters, and they were very frank letters, which kind of gives you an idea of what kind of advisor and the kind of person he would have been in the circle if he had been in the country. Because Washington had a tremendous amount of affection for Morris and a great deal of respect. Again, even though they were personally very different people. I mean, Washington was, as we repeatedly say, a very aloof, formal person, whereas Gouverneur Morris was a very outgoing, very sophisticated, but very sarcastic man. He did not suffer fools well, and so that they were very different in many ways. Though physically, people said that they actually resembled each other quite a bit, that they were about the same size. Mm-hmm. In fact, Houdon used Morris as his body model for the famous statue once he was back in France, because they were of a similar size, though of course Morris was missing one of his legs, which Houdon ignored that.
And kept that under wraps.
Yes. And again, a very happy-go-lucky, kind of fun-loving man who never met a stranger, and loved the ladies, very much so. In fact, perhaps a little bit too much, hence the leg problem. But they were very, very close.
That's the story.
That's the story.
That's the story.
Yes.
Yeah. But, I think Morris was probably one of the closest people to Washington in terms of candor and frankness. That he was able to say things to him that even his even close friends such as Robert Morris, who's no relation, had to tread somewhat lightly around Washington. And Morris didn't. Although the story about the slap on the back is apparently apocryphal. That never happened. There's no documentation. It seems to have been an invention of the mid-19th century. The story that Morris had been given a wager that he could be familiar with Washington, and he called him George and slapped him on the back and got a stare that would have frozen over hell. That did not happen, and I can see where it wouldn't. I don't think Morris would have crossed that line either.
I think it's hard to say how Martha Washington shaped the presidency, because we don't really know what their relationship was like when they were alone together. We know that she took a deep interest in everything about him, that she was fiercely protective of him. But as far as how she shaped the presidency, we only can see it from the sort of the external signs. For instance, As we say, she's the female face of the presidency during those 8 years. And she comported herself with a great deal of dignity, but also warmth. I mean, there was no one who became acquainted with Martha Washington who did not develop great affection for her. And so she was kind of the warm side of the couple. She was not aloof. As we say, that if she did not embrace people literally, she certainly did emotionally. And as a result, did humanize the presidency in that way.
She was a delightful companion by all accounts, completely unassuming and unpretentious, and perfectly willing to shoulder the burdens, the social burdens of the office without complaint, except to a very close group of family. And from that, we know that she found them to be very burdensome, very onerous, and frequently she pined to go home. Abigail did. Abigail Adams went home, and she did not come back. She was not in Philadelphia during the entire time that the presidency was based. The temporary capital was there. Martha never deserted her post, and she frequently, during the Revolution, was in considerable danger going to and from Mount Vernon to wherever he was. Many people thought this marriage loveless, a companionate marriage at best, but they did not realize that these two people would move mountains to be with each other. And Henrietta Liston, the wife of the British minister who succeeded George Hamilton, was fairly close to the Washingtons, despite the brevity of their acquaintance. And she and her husband went to see Martha after Washington died, and she was shocked, because she'd always thought it was a companionate marriage. This woman, she said, she's grieving herself to death. Indeed, she was. And she grieved herself to death after he died and did not live much beyond him, as she said she wouldn't, at his bedside. Even his biographer paints a sketchy picture of him. It's sad because he seems to have been a troubled man, and by all accounts he committed suicide at the end of his life, although that seems to have been more from physical distress than mental anguish. There was something wrong with him, and I think he couldn't take the pain. He came as a very young man to Mount Vernon to tutor the children, Nellie and Wash, and became Washington's secretary as a consequence of that wasn't enough for him to do, to tutor the children. And Washington's books were in disarray. Lund, his cousin, had been looking after Mount Vernon during the Revolution, and when Washington came home, the thing was a bloody mess. Nothing tallied, nothing balanced. He was deeply in debt. And so Lear came in and took care of that, as well as began taking care of the correspondence. He was Harvard educated, something of a polyglot, and good with the children. Martha adored him because he was very kind to her and helped her write letters because she was very nearly illiterate. Her education had been dancing schools and things like that. So he was able to help her with that sort of thing and do it in a way that was not at all condescending.
And I don't think he cared for Washington at first, because Washington did tend to be aloof, especially with employees, and that's essentially what he was early on. But the devotion to Washington that he developed was almost beyond hero worship. He had a tremendous amount of affection for Washington, but also he was very protective. What he did during the presidency, and we try to make this clear, he's called a secretary, but he really was the equivalent of what we would call today chief of staff. He handled all of the details of the household, as well as important correspondence with Congress and diplomats. He did so many things that we'll probably never even know completely, and wore himself out in the process. And plus, he was never treated outside of the household, I think, with the respect that he was inside the household. And that's why he did experiment with leaving. Particularly, he was planning to leave before she died, but when his wife, Polly, died suddenly in 1793, he kind of sped up those plans. But he never, as we point out, he never really found his way. And until he found his way back to the Washingtons, and of course was working for Washington again as his secretary when Washington died, and he was there in the House. And that, I think that in some ways that untethered him, and he never really was going to be comfortable in any other job that he had after that.
He also found Jefferson very congenial, and that became a problem, especially after Jefferson's departure from the administration. Lear and Jefferson philosophically were quite compatible. And he became a Jeffersonian, which estranged him from Martha and the rest of the family, even though he had married Fanny and then another niece, another niece when Fanny died. That is a tragedy. There's always the surrounding aura of some sort of mystery or intrigue about Lear as a result of that, I think, because he's often blamed for purging the papers, for going into the papers and doing things to them, possibly at the behest of Jefferson. And there's no evidence for that, other than the speculation that he might have done this because he did become a Jeffersonian. And the division on that score was so much of a significant and dire that once crossed over into you became an apostate to the people who had left, and they never forgave him. Lear was careless about some things. He stole from Washington. He didn't actually put his hand in the till, but he redirected some rent money into his own accounts. And when Washington saw this in the ledgers and confronted the people who he thought were in arrears, they told him they paid Lear. And Lear had to confess that he had been short and had been, as a consequence, in need of funds. And this seemed to be an unauthorized loan, which, oddly enough, any other human being in the world, it would have been an irreparable breach. But for Washington with Lear, no, he forgave him and said to continue as always, as he did. And Lear was with him when he died. The idea that this is a completely blank slate, everything is new. And we have written elsewhere about this, the great fortune the country had in someone who was like George Washington, who realized this and then surrounded himself with people who were equally cognizant of the significance of every single move, major and minor. We've likened it to someone sitting down at a desk with a blank sheet of paper in which everything they write is indelibly unerasable, that it is in place and will not just affect what's going on right then with that sentence, but all the other sentences that will follow it forever. And that kind of challenge would, in someone sitting at a piece of paper, create an incredible writer's block. For someone who's establishing a new government in the uncharted seas of domestic and international affairs, well, it's no wonder that he didn't want to do it. Washington tried every artifice and stratagem to avoid the presidency and was finally really dragooned into the job and tried to leave it as soon as he could. He actually thought he would only be there for 2 years, that he would get the ball rolling and then go home. And then, of course, all things happening didn't allow that even after 4 years. So I think probably the idea of setting so many precedents that would be so indelible in the way the government ran was one of the things that is most remarkable about the first presidency.
And I think as far as policy issues, obviously the first one, and perhaps the most daunting, was the financial issues. The country was not only broke, it was heavily in debt. And of course, picking Alexander Hamilton to head the Treasury Department, which of course was not necessarily, it was certainly, he was not his first choice, that Robert Morris was probably his first choice, that it was so fortunate because Hamilton was able to certainly not pay off the debt, but to take care of those issues in a logical way, a very planful way, that certainly put him at odds with Jefferson and others, Madison first. But doing that in the way that he did, and then trusting, and the part of George Washington, trusting Hamilton to handle, because Washington was not a numbers guy. This was one area that he, I won't say was happy to turn over to someone else, but it was not something that he felt particularly comfortable with. And so I think that was the first policy issue that was going to really start the presidency off on a very good footing. And I think a lot of people realize that. Then, of course, there's the issues of foreign policy, which are going to dominate the latter part of his first term, but primarily his second term.
Yeah, the Anglo-French War became the unforeseen but absolutely unavoidable controversy that began to affect almost everything in domestic politics. Well, Washington was quite correct in that war is entirely the most expensive thing a government can do. And it was the kind of thing that this government could not afford to do. He thought it would be a disaster in terms of its domestic impact, and that he thought internationally it could be quite dire, but dire enough to destroy the experiment. That defeat in a war with Britain or France was a quick avenue to the end, to the conclusion of everything. Nothing else would follow. So he was committed from the outset to avoid that for all of its potential consequences and ramifications. It's interesting because neutrality was a question that came about in a way that we wouldn't think of. There was a good deal of consideration that the executive had no right to issue a proclamation of neutrality any more than he had a right to declare war. This was a congressional prerogative. And there was, this is one of the first fissures that begins to appear in the Jefferson, Madison, Washington dynamic, that Madison was quite troubled by this. And Jefferson was as well, so much so that he managed to excise the word from the proclamation, so that it's technically not a neutrality proclamation. It's a non-involvement, we're standing away proclamation. And that was a semantical concession that some people were not happy about. Hamilton wasn't, because he thought that it would quite disruptive to Anglo-American relations, and he was highly intent on that because of the financial benefits that would come from having Britain be the principal trading partner.
But that's also one of the reasons why Washington, in fact, he was here. He was at Mount Vernon when he received word that Great Britain and France were then officially at war, and that it seriously depressed him as well as alarmed him. Because if they were at war, of course, a lot of the fighting they were going to be doing was going to be on the seas, and that would certainly disrupt American trade, and that was something that Hamilton, of course, was concerned about as well, because the customs duties were one of the major sources of income for the country at this time, and so that would undoubtedly cut down on those duties. And so Washington did rush back to Philadelphia once he had heard about the war, and then that's when they started hashing out the so-called neutrality proclamation, because they did want both sides, both the British and the French, to realize, okay, we're not part of this, so don't bother our ships. Let them continue doing what they're doing, so that we can bring in the goods and collect the customs duties. And that's before Edmund Genet has even made it to Philadelphia. He landed in Charleston and then made his, ironically, kind of royal progress up to Philadelphia. So this was partly getting ready for him, how they were going to deal with him. Hamilton even suggested that since he was the emissary of Republican France, that we should not even perhaps even receive him, because we had made our diplomatic arrangements with the King of France, who, of course, by the time Genet arrived, the king was no more. But at least Jefferson did win that point, and Washington did receive Genet. And then, of course, things went downhill from there after that first meeting. Washington was never going to like Genet the whole time he was here. And things only went from bad to worse.
Yes. Britain took its sweet time sending someone. There was a long period where we had nobody representing the Court of St. James here in the country, except for quite unofficial. We had some consular people, and George Beckwith, who was a spy, who came down from Canada periodically and had tea with Hamilton. But the appointment of a man to actually come here from London in the ministerial role took them quite some time. And then when they did send someone, it was a child, a completely inexperienced diplomat who knew Thomas Jefferson quite casually from their residence in Paris together at some point when George Hammond, the young man, was in residence there as a junior diplomat. And he actually seems to have thought that casual acquaintance would smooth the way. It didn't. Jefferson was a completely different man as Secretary of State, who was not any more prepared to give George Hammond any favors as he was any of the others. Genet was a bit different, but Genet wore out his welcome within weeks. He was a disaster.
Well, part of the reason it was unpopular is that the United States did not really get much from it. And a lot of people had expected more, particularly trade concessions with the West Indies, which were very minor. And it did require that the British leave the Northwest Post, but gave them a good deal of time to do that. And so I think the fact that it appeared to many people that Jay had not really accomplished very much. And then there were the rumors coming out of Great Britain while he was there that he had actually deigned to kiss the hand of the Queen, that in other words, that he was rather a submissive diplomat. Now, I'm not saying that he was, but that was the perception. Particularly by Westerners who believed that Jay had, during the Confederation period, had betrayed their interests with the so-called Jay-Gardoki Treaty that was never ratified, that essentially gave up any use of the Mississippi River in return for trade concessions that would help the Northeast. And so they had never been happy about Jay going in the first place, and in fact there were stories about Kentuckians actually burning him in effigy before they even knew about the treaty. And then of course the famous story that he said that he would, once he returned, that he could travel the entire eastern seaboard at night by the light of his own burning effigies. That those people were not predisposed to accept anything that he did. And the fact that he gained so few concessions from the British seemed to reinforce those ideas in a lot of people's minds. But Washington did ultimately decide, after the Senate did barely ratify the treaty, to actually sign it and put it into effect, which for the Jeffersonians, sometimes called the Madisonians at this time, that hurt Washington's popularity in a number of places.
Treaty had a troubled history. It was hard to get it here. The copies of it were lost at sea, and finally one of them made it back. And when it arrived, Randolph, who was then by then Secretary of State, and Jefferson were nonplussed. Washington were nonplussed. They read over this and were quite unhappy with it. It wasn't a very good agreement. And the Northwest Post thing, they had a year to get out of those. And the same people who had told Jay this, that they were going to do this, had told him the same thing in 1783 in Paris when they were negotiating the treaty to end the war. It was as the old saying, deja vu all over again. And then the secrecy surrounding it, they put it under a ban of secrecy when the Senate debated it, which was breached almost immediately and published. The thing was published, but it was published in such a way that it seemed as though it had been sneaked out. When Washington had actually authorized the publication of the treaty, they were just late doing it. So it seemed as though there was some sort of skullduggery going on about it. And then when it was finally signed, that was under the whip of the emerging Randolph controversy, which also sullied it. So there are those who now even say that we would have been at war with Britain had in the absence of the treaty. I don't know. I do know that James Monroe was sent over by Thomas Jefferson to essentially do the same thing as tensions were increasing in 1805 and 1806. And Monroe brought back a treaty that was precisely the same sort of thing that Jay had done, and Jefferson didn't even submit it. He put it in his desk drawer and forgot it. So there was no dealing with these people. They were in what they thought was an existential crisis with first Revolutionary and then Napoleonic France. And so they were going to impress seamen, and they were going to interrupt trade, and they were going to declare contraband out of all manner of things that were going to impinge on American commerce, because they could not see that anything other than that was a de facto ally of the French. And so that's how it played out. Neutrality was a myth from the very beginning. Washington brought from the Revolution a sense of consultation with his military staff. And that is in many ways what he does when he becomes president. He treats these people as subordinates, and he is a chief, but also as he is a chief among equals. And as a consequence, he asks for them to give him opinions on all manner of things that are outside their particular bailiwicks. This causes trouble because people who are turf-oriented, like Hamilton and Jefferson, who do not necessarily see consultation on matters in State Department or Treasury Department outside of that bailiwick to be anything other than meddling. And Washington originally wanted written opinions from everyone because he could find those much easier to digest and ruminate over. And he thought meetings, as they do, tend to make people posture and speak glibly or off the cuff and improvise rather than think. And so his attitudes about that had to change because people were not getting along anymore. And he thought that after a time that if he had everyone sit down together face to face, that he could promote harmony again. And unfortunately, that didn't quite work out.
And he assumed that if people were sitting face to face, that they would be less likely to be rude to each other and to get along. And in some ways that happened, but then they did a lot of their maneuvering behind the scenes. And so that didn't really bring the harmony that he wanted.
He even had them eat with the family, with Nellie and Wash and Martha and Tobias Lear. And they would all sit down for the 3 o'clock meal, which was the main meal in the household. And the idea that people who do this sort of social interaction would find it more difficult to be disagreeable in a professional one.
Well, there weren't any more great American leaders in the cabinet. The closest was Edmund Randolph, who took Jefferson's place at the State Department, so he left the Attorney General's position. And the other replacements, Oliver Wolcott was certainly capable. He was Hamilton's hand-picked successor for the Treasury Department, and he had worked with Hamilton for the entire first term into the second term. So he knew what he was doing, and he was competent. He didn't have the creativity that Hamilton did. He certainly didn't have the charisma. He did not have the sort of political connections, the kind of political clout that Hamilton had developed. And then the Secretary of War, when Henry Knox did leave the War Department, and Knox we describe as he kind of lived in the shadow of Hamilton and Jefferson because they were so shiny and so brilliant, but that he was quite capable and did some very interesting things in the War Department. But when he left the War Department, by that point, Washington was having trouble getting people to even take minor posts within the government. It didn't pay well. All of Washington's first cabinet suffered financially as a result of being in the government, which is why Hamilton left in the first place. He went back to the law because he could make a living doing that, and Knox was broke, and he had a very large family that he had to support, and so he left, and Washington couldn't get anyone to take the job, and he ended up settling for Timothy Pickering, who was a very disagreeable man, and not particularly brilliant, not at all brilliant, not terribly imaginative, competent, but again, disagreeable. He was suspicious. He was paranoid about a lot of things. And ultimately, the combination of Pickering and Wolcott, two New Englanders, in some ways were going to isolate Washington from some of his closest friends. And it wasn't necessarily an unhappy time, but it really did end up surrounding Washington with virtual strangers. And so that second circle, when you're talking about the cabinet, is going to be a far different circle than what he started with.
And that is true. The idea that Washington continues in the presidency as a linear line of accomplishment is sadly not true, because in the second term, so many things begin to impinge on the presidency and him personally that he reacts quite understandably but regrettably as though these are personal affronts. For the first time, there are criticisms in the newspapers directly aimed at him rather than the office or the entourage or whatever. And Pickering and Wolcott create an atmosphere of suspicion. They are arch Federalists and are quite brash about it, to the point that they are impolitic. And we must remember they are the ones who actually begin the headlong plunge into reactionaryism with the Alien Sedition Act. So the Sedition Act of 1798 is one of the most odious pieces of legislation and is within living memory of the Revolution. And these were the people who sat up at night going through newspapers to find people to prosecute for speaking their mind under protections of the First Amendment. And these are the people who are influencing the second term. And it's one of the reasons that Washington does something incredible for him that he would have never considered doing in the first term, and publicly criticizing in his annual message the democratic societies and imputing to them seditious purposes. And this was a loyal opposition. And as Madison quite correctly said, and Jefferson agreed, if resistance to government policy is going to be regarded as disloyalty, then the experiment is coming to an end.
I don't know. I see the greatest success of Washington's presidency as being establishing the precedents
Yes.
that future presidents are going to build on in establishing a stable government that people came to respect. Even if they did criticize it occasionally, they respected it. And as a result, those precedents of those 8 years Some of them may be good precedents, maybe not so good precedents, but they did establish a stable government so that when there was a contested election in 1796, when you have people actually running against one another for the presidency, which didn't happen for both of Washington's presidency, there was no thought that if one side didn't win, that there would be some great upheaval. And in fact, it was an extremely smooth transition to the Adams presidency, which of course then brought the odd circumstance of the loser becoming the vice president in 1796. But everyone seemed extremely congenial during that transition, which surprised people in other countries that happened the way it did.
Yes. I think possibly the greatest success Washington as president was that he went home. Mm-hmm. That after 2 terms he said no more and went home. And we say in the book, in the opening of it, that there were possibly, it's a stretch, but possibly there were other people who could have beaten Britain in the Revolution. But it is highly unlikely that there is another person in the world who would have ended the way George Washington did, by handing over his commission, returning the army to Congress, and going home. This was unheard of. Washington was actually touted as a possible monarch in a Cromwellian sense at the end. In 1783, there were actually within his own official family people who were urging him to do this. He would have none of it. In 1792, Washington wanted to go home. And he only stayed because people from completely diametrically opposed views, the poles of Hamilton and Jefferson, told him if he did, the country could not survive. So he did what he had to do. And then in 1796, he insisted. And most people thought he would be president for life. They couldn't envision a landscape without him on it in the political sense. And when he did say that he would not do it, the farewell address, of course, published in September before the election, it was late enough so that it wouldn't cause any kind of disruption or stir, but still was a finality. There was a sense of that being something incredibly significant of everybody. We mentioned that Jefferson at Monticello read this and realized this was one of the best men that he'd ever known, or would ever know.
Well, we'd always admired him,
Yes.
and we had done some work on him earlier, not anything to this scale, and broached it with our editor at Random House, and he liked the idea. Mm-hmm. He at first brought the idea of a full-blown biography, and we said, well, that's been done, and it's been done recently.
Really.
And so we thought, because there really hasn't been a whole lot done on his presidency, only as part of those biographies. Absolutely. I think the Forrest McDonald study years ago, which looks mainly at the events, not the people, which it's a very good book, but it doesn't focus so much on the people themselves. And so when we brought that up, he liked the idea.
And Richard Norton Smith did the Patriarch book, which is about Washington and the central role he occupies. But the idea of something being revealed as a reflection on the people who were around him struck us as a unique way of looking at it. And again, we were talking earlier that the book was much longer. Because we actually have almost an entire chapter on Robert Dinwiddie, who was, as Washington was quite young, is one of the more unfortunate relationships in terms of Dinwiddie being pretty honorable and Washington being pretty rotten about things. And the line that we labored over and finally said at the very end, Dinwiddie, because he went home and became a staunch royalist. He was intent upon parliamentary prerogative in terms of those upstart Yankees, And it said that Robert Dinwiddie's positions finally got him George Washington got him his commission.